As we head deeper into the final week of the Tour de France, it's time to look back at this year's race and analyse the key tech trends. Now, Tadej Pogačar looks set for another dominant win in the race for the yellow jersey and has been at the forefront of this year's key trends. And as with previous tours, we've weighed and measured a number of pro bikes at the Grand Depart, and almost every rider will be affected by the incoming changes to the UCI's technical regulations for 2026. And while safety in pro cycling has been in the spotlight again, this year's tour has shown that those who govern the sport ought to put their own house in order before hanging the riders out to dry. While we got all hot under the collar about Tadej Pogačar's sub 6.8 kg Colnago V5 RS and an unreleased Cervelo R5 at this year's Grand Depart, neither bike has seen significant action at the front of the race so far, and instead, the race's two main protagonists, Pogačar and his great rival Jonas Vingegaard, have been riding their aero bikes on practically every single stage, except of course the two time trials. Now in Pogačar's case, he rode a white World Champions themed Colnago Y1 RS for the opening 2 weeks of the race before switching to an unpainted white weenie build for the mountain time trial on stage 13, and then a gloss black version for the Ventoux stage and beyond. Now the latter is claimed to weigh a little more than 7 kilograms, although it's not clear if that includes pedals, bottle cages, a bike computer and so on, but it is in any case impressively light. Set up in full sprint mode, we weighed Vingegaard's new Cervelo S5 at 7.385 kilograms before the race started in Lille. Now that is more than 500 grams above the UCI's minimum bike weight limit, but there was plenty of room to go lighter with only minor equipment changes. For the Stage 16 Summit finish to Mont Ventoux, for example, Vingegaard swapped in lighter wheels and tyres, and he even kept his 1x drivetrain, all of which raises the question, yet again, about whether the UCI ought to lower its minimum bike weight limit of 6.8 kilos. Now as things stand, there appears to be little reason for riders like Pogačar or Vingegaard to opt for a lightweight climbing bike if their aero bikes are only a few hundred grams heavier, if that. Even dropping the weight limit by just a few hundred grams, for example, might make climbers think twice about which bike to use on mountain stages and could spur greater innovation in an area that has felt increasingly irrelevant to pro racing in recent years. It might also help smaller riders for whom 6.8 kilos makes up a larger percentage of their overall system weight, and this would be especially helpful in the light of the recently announced changes to the minimum handlebar widths. More on that later, which many in the sport feel will unfairly penalise smaller riders. On the other hand, Dan Bigham, the head of engineering at Red Bull Bora Hansgrohe and a key voice in the debate about safety in pro cycling, has previously said that he thinks the UCI should consider raising its minimum bike weight limit to allow for greater factors of safety. Any change would therefore need to consider exactly what makes a bike safe to ride and race, and whether changing the regulation could affect those characteristics. After a number of years of seeing Tadej Pogačar and many other riders on increasingly wide rims and tyres at the Tour, things have begun to level off in this area. Overall, the median nominal or labelled tyre sizes were 29 at the rear and 28 up front, with the average measured widths coming up slightly wider at 30.23mm at the rear and 30.01mm at the front. However, while Pogačar's Colnago Y1 RS was equipped with Continental's new 30C archetype tyres at this year's Grand Depart, the world champion has actually used 28C Conti GP5000T TTR time trial tyres for practically every stage. In fact, a close look at photos from this year's race suggests that the GP5000T TTR is an extremely popular tyre amongst Continental sponsored teams, which is currently only available in a 25 and 28C size, whilst other teams have also frequently turned to 28 and 29C time trial tyres such as the Vittoria Corsa Pro Speed TLR. If we had to guess why tyre and rim widths appear to have plateaued or in some cases got narrower, we'd put our money on riders perhaps reaching the limit of how much weight they're willing to carry for the sake of improved aerodynamics and rolling resistance. Now the key selling point of Pogačar's new NV SES 4.5 Pro wheels, for example, is that they are lighter and help get his bikes that little bit closer to the UCI's minimum bike weight limit. Similarly, the recently launched Reval Rapide CLX freewheel set retained the same 35mm external rim width on the front wheel at its widest point as on the outgoing model, and instead focused on cutting weight through the use of updated hubs, carbon spokes and a shallower rear rim. Now the likes of Remco Evenepoel and Primož Roglic were also using unreleased specialised turbo cotton TLR tyres in a nominal size 30C, but these actually measured around 29mm wide on the bikes of those two riders when we saw them at the Grand Depart in Lille. DT Swiss's latest ARC 1100 wheels also remain fairly narrow, as used by the likes of Julian Alaphilippe and Tobias Johannesson, with external rips ranging from 26 to 29mm on rims designed for mass start road races. Now that said, we only saw one 25C tyre on a road bike at this year's Grand Depart on the front wheel of Geraint Thomas's Pinarello Dogma F, so it does seem that the days of narrow tyres at the Tour are largely behind us. Short cranks have been a notable trend amongst high-profile riders for a while now, with the likes of Tadej Pogačar and Remco Evenepoel using 165mm cranks for the last few seasons. Jonas Vingegaard also caused a media frenzy earlier this year when he was spotted trialling tiny 150mm cranks at the Volta ao Algarve. Yet, while he didn't bring those to this year's Tour, Vingegaard's Cervelo S5 was nevertheless equipped with the shortest cranks we saw at this year's race at just 160mm. Perhaps more surprising though was Matteo Jorgensen, who stands at 190cm tall according to Pro Cycling Stats, who was using 165mm cranks, which just goes to show it's not just the shorter riders experimenting with reducing their crank lengths. Overall, the median crank length at this year's Tour was 170mm, but the two most popular sizes were 165 and 172.5, which suggests there might be a bit of a split occurring in the Tour peloton between the riders who are convinced of the potential benefits of shorter cranks and those who perhaps prefer to stick with what they know. The UCI recently revealed that it would be cracking down on narrow handlebars, super deep rims, time trial helmets and potentially big gears in road races next season, and our measurements at this year's Grand Depart show that a vast majority of riders might need to change their bike setups. Of the 16 bike setups that we measured, for example, only 3 bikes met the proposed limit of 320mm in between the tips of the brake hoods. The average distance between the tips of the riders' brake hoods, however, was 30cm, and there were a number of bikes set up at 28 or narrower between the hoods. Now, the tips of the brake hoods on Tobias Johannesson's Ridley Noah Fast 3.0, for example, were just 26cm apart. Likewise, every rider using a SRAM drivetrain was using gear ratios that would see them fall foul of the maximum rollout of 10.46 metres proposed by the UCI's upcoming trial, which is reportedly due to take place in October. A number of Shimano-sponsored riders were also using chainrings bigger than 54T, which would also be banned under the trial regulations, assuming they stick with 11T sprockets on the cassettes. Less attention has been on the incoming changes to maximum rim depth, which will be limited to 65mm from 2026, but spare a thought for Swiss side, which sponsors the decathlon AG2R La Mondiale team. Felix Gall and his teammates were running the brand's latest Hadron Ultimate 680 reel set on their Van Rysel RCR-F Aero road bikes, which was launched just 2 weeks after details of the UCI's proposed regulation changes were revealed in the press. As its name suggests, the new wheel set features 68mm deep rims and will therefore not be allowed in mass start road races from next season. Riders would still be able to use them in time trials, of course, but in an open letter published last week, Swiss side claimed that it had received no warnings about the incoming rule changes and called the 6-month notice period for changes to be implemented inadequate. It also challenged the UCI's assertion that limiting rim depth to 65mm would improve rider safety, as it claimed that rim height has a limited impact on stability, predictable handling, and safety. Now, according to Swiss side's own measurements of what it calls steering moment, rim depth has far less influence than rim shape, tyre choice, and frame geometry. And whatever we might think of the proposed regulations, all of this adds further evidence to the claim that the UCI has failed to properly engage with key stakeholders during this process. Although the UCI stated goal for the updated regulations is to ensure ever safer and fairer competition, riders at this year's Tour have still been faced with courses that, at face value, appear to contravene the UCI's very own safety guidelines. The flat, fast run-in into Dunkirk on stage 3, for example, saw 2 major crashes in the peloton that looked to result from poor course design. One of the pre-race favourites, Remco Evenepoel, hit the deck alongside a number of other riders with 3 kilometres to go in a crash during a sudden narrowing of the road that seemed to catch many in the peloton out. Then, with 1.6 kilometres to go as riders were gearing up for a sprint finish, there was a 90-degree right-hand bend, and then the road twisted and snaked all the way to the line, with another high-speed pile-up occurring during the last 250 metres. Now, the UCI's Organiser's Guide to Road Events Handbook states that in flat stages, the final 500 metres should, as far as possible, be straight, or at least there should be no dangerous bends. And the fact that most riders escaped without serious injuries from those crashes is besides the point. That if a course doesn't follow the governing body's own safety guidelines, then surely it shouldn't be approved or raced on, especially at the Tour, where there is so much at stake and the riders are all at the peak of their powers. It is, of course, fair to say that crashes during bike races simply happen sometimes, and there's not always someone or something specifically to blame. Jasper Philipsen, for example, abandoned the Tour with a broken collarbone earlier that very same day, following an unfortunate crash on a wide, straight road in the run-up to the day's intermediate sprint. However, rather than just blaming the riders for crashes or enacting new equipment and regulations without input from key stakeholders, which some believe will have little impact on safety anyway, those that govern cycling and organise the Tour should ensure that their own houses are in order as well. As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to see another video from this year's Tour de France, why not check out this one?